Tessellations are infinitely repeating patterns that cover a flat surface. But here on Earth, we have limited time and materials, so we can only make some subset of the infinite pattern. So how do we know that these patterns actually can repeat infinitely? That they don't act differently off of our cutout? Well, that comes down to symmetries. And what I'm going to show you is some different symmetry types that have been known for a long time. They're known as the 17 wallpaper tilings, although I've condensed them down to 7 different styles that basically are the 17 wallpaper tilings, but you don't need to care about whether you have mirror symmetry lines and in what positions. So let's check those out. I'm going to start with the hexagon type. So we've got hexagons and triangles, and there are simpler and more complex versions of these patterns. Now these are origami tessellations. I folded these from a flat sheet of paper, yes, including the background grid lines. And the reason I know that they can all repeat infinitely is because they each obey these symmetry patterns. They each have positions of 6-fold rotational symmetry, surrounded by positions of 3-fold and 2-fold rotational symmetries. So these numbers are meaning that you can rotate in 6 equally spaced orientations around this point where my mouse is and see exactly the same thing. Of course, with this image, we have numbers, so the text is going to get rotated, but the dots will be in the same positions. Likewise, 3 rotation chunks for the 3-fold position, 2 for the 2-fold position, and all I need to be able to repeat this entire pattern is one of these hexagon blocks. So when I have one block, and let's say we're going back to this simpler hexagons and triangles pattern, I don't necessarily want to cut up my triangles to make that block. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, there are 6 3-fold positions around the hexagon, that's our unit tile, and each of those is shared with 3 different tiles. Okay, so 6 things shared with 3 each, 6 divided by 3, 2. 2 of these 3-fold positions belong to the 6-fold position in the center of the tile. And there's going to be 2 orientations. If we go back, 2 orientations of triangle. So you can see this triangle is the exact same orientation as these other 2 are going around, but it's a different orientation from the nearest neighbor. So if we take a big hexagon and 2 triangles that are neighbors, we can then use that to copy paste everywhere. Our next symmetry is the square symmetry. So in this symmetry, we have 2 distinct positions of 4-fold rotational symmetry, 1 position of 2-fold rotational symmetry. This is a alternating square twist pattern that I call square alchemy. And then we can use this in more complex forms. So we can have 4-fold positions with 8 right triangle twists, 4 on the front, 4 on the back around them, and then 4-fold positions in these other large squares. And I just noticed for the first time that the outline of this large square is the exact same outline as we have in between these right triangles. But anyways, then we have a 2-fold position between pairs of 4-fold positions. And the key thing with this symmetry is that we go 4, 2, second 4 at a right angle. So that is borne out by the tile representation, where we have these square tiles. And what we need to be able to copy this everywhere, so the chunk, that's not necessarily just the tile itself, but taking into account more the pieces that we're using, is this blue 4, 2, gold 4, 2 block. If I have those 4, I can copy and paste it all over. And then next symmetry type, we've got triangles. So we've got triangle 1, triangle 2, and then this image is coarse enough that you can't really see the third position of threefold rotational symmetry, which is in between these 6 triangles that I already pointed out. It's hard to see that there's 6 of them here. In the next image, we can see 1 threefold rotationally symmetric position, 2 threefold rotationally symmetric positions, and the third in here. Now the thing with these positions, these 3 positions, need to form an equilateral triangle. So if I have the locations of 2 of the positions, I can identify exactly where the position of rotational symmetry that's missing needs to go. And so when I'm playing with these patterns, I can have different twists. These are these twisty structures in the paper arranged in my crease pattern, in my folded grid, and be able to solve for, okay, what needs to go in that final position. So those 3 positions of threefold rotational symmetry, usually you'll see the unit tile for triangular symmetry as this rhombus containing 2 triangles, because again, there's 2 different orientations of triangles. And so we need to include both orientations to get the full pattern. And this structure we'll come back to and play with later on, so make sure to keep watching through the end. Then we have a parallelogram type symmetry. And here there's no 6-fold, 4-fold, or 3-fold rotationally symmetric positions. There's just 2-fold rotational symmetries in the center of each parallelogram, which actually is a rhombus on the opposite side, and also in between the corners in 2 distinct corners. So we can see this also in a different grid type, in the square grid, where I have positions of 2-fold rotational symmetry between the pairs of squares that you see on this side of the paper. There's equivalent pairs of squares on the opposite side as well, but there's this cluster of 4 squares, and in the center there's a position of 2-fold rotational symmetry. In between these 2, position of 2-fold rotational symmetry. In between these 2, there's a position of 2-fold rotational symmetry. And in between these 2 as well, there's a position of 2-fold rotational symmetry. And these are going to be lining up. So you have all kinds of lines that you can find of these rotational symmetries, especially if you're working on a triangle grid. On the square grid, it really just looks like 2-fold in these 2 linear directions. When you stick them on the rhombuses, you get those 3 axes that you can play with. So next up, rectangular symmetry. So if I have some block of twists that in and of itself doesn't have rotational symmetry, but then I mirror it everywhere, I get positions of rotational symmetry at the 4 corners of the block. I call this rectangular symmetry, And I've added a little marking inside of the rectangles so you can see that there's no rotational symmetry inside of that block. And up until now, we've really ignored the function of mirror symmetry, which can show up in, well, when you're using chiral twists, it can't show up in the hexagonal symmetry type, but you can still have it in the triangular and square symmetry types. Although if you use it in parallelograms, then you get to rectangular type symmetries. So regardless of where we're putting the mirror lines, for the rectangles, it's kind of necessary because we also want to enforce these right angles between the different twofold rotationally symmetric positions. And coming on to the next symmetry type, this one is a linear symmetry. So we've got mirror symmetry lines in one direction only. And the things in between the mirror symmetry lines don't have any rotational symmetry. So here I have the mirror lines going vertically. In the tessellation, I had them going horizontally. But either way, you're able to get one direction of mirror symmetry lines and basically repeat a whole pattern with some structure internal to the column that is repeating multiple times inside the column and then mirrored between them. And then last but not least, if you don't have any rotational symmetry, any mirror symmetry, you just have a chunk of things that you're translating and plopping down. This is translational symmetry. And it's, I'll say the rarest one for me to use because there's actually not so many shapes that you can do this with. And even if you have these trapezoid twists on the same side of the paper, you're going to end up in the linear symmetry style because you need to alternate between right-handed and left-handed forms next to each other because the pleats need to go together to lay down flat. And so you're going to end up with mirror symmetry if you have the same thing on the same side of the paper. So it's really just having these different twists, or same twists or different twists on opposite sides that you get this translational symmetry structure. So that brings us back to our problem of how we represent these things. So, okay, symmetry's great, very helpful. But how do we actually represent these patterns? So I take a pattern like this, and this is one of my very earliest designs, back when I was still sketching things in notebooks. And sketching things in notebooks works decently well for patterns that have all of their twists on the same side of the paper. So all of the twists are on the opposite side. And I can abstract that away by just drawing what the end result is going to look like and making sure that I have the woven structure which will enforce my chirality rules. But that starts to fall apart when you start seeing tessellations with twists on both sides of the paper. When you start doing things with triangle grids. When you start using symmetry structures that are more broadly placed apart, and when you start wanting to have the repeats of your pattern line up with the edge of the paper. This is something that you need a more extended drawing to make happen. And a few more examples. Let's take a deeper look at this pattern in particular. And I'll switch the screen over here so we can see what the heck is going on. So this is the crease pattern for how to get to this tessellation, this blue one. I call it knotted web. And zooming in here, we can spot multiple positions of threefold rotational symmetry. So I've got a threefold rotationally symmetric position in this cluster of triangle twists. And zooming in on the screen as well, this cluster of triangle twists in the paper is 3 twists on the front and 3 twists on the back, both closed triangles. And by the way, I should say that the closed is referring to this closed hole. Open is when you have a open hole, which when we flip over, we can see it looks like the exact same pattern on the backside. This is a property called isoarea. So I've got these 3 closed twists and open hexagons on one side, and I have the exact same twists on the other side. So we've got 1, 2, 3 positions of threefold rotational symmetry. And if you don't believe me, pause, take a look. There's actually no 6-fold rotation in this tessellation, even though I'm using hexagon twists. The symmetry is about the broader pattern instead of what's happening just locally at that location. So, if you recall back to the triangle symmetry, that means that we're going to need our 3 locations of threefold rotational symmetry, and that's it. So what we can do in the pattern is say, I'm going to select all and get rid of everything that's not part of that repeating unit. So that is my repeating unit. It's got our loop of 6 triangles. It's got our hexagon on the front. It's got our hexagon on the back. And so from there, and I'll switch the view here so you can see more of what I'm doing. I can just copy, move it over, and with the right snapping settings, I can just paste that in. And then I can copy those again. And if I want to prove to myself that this is going to completely cover the space, then I can bring it down here, and I can even go for like the full surrounding, getting one more copy around my initial copy. I see I didn't leave any gaps. And since I used those symmetries, this is proving to myself already that I can cover as much space as I want with that snippet of crease pattern. And so this is so much faster than drawing each of those lines individually. So much faster that I'm going to do a whole live stream series on each of the symmetry types and like the drawing techniques that I use. Because after drawing over 400 crease patterns, I've definitely learned a few things. And learning about drawing the crease patterns fed back into my design style. So now I'm much more aware of the symmetries when I'm designing these tessellations, and it all loops back together. So when I'm figuring out what structures to use to design the tessellations, how to fill those structures, there's always this playing with symmetry that's happening when you're working with tessellations. So that's not all. You can also get the templates that I use for drawing these things. There's a link in the description down below, and play with them. And use these templates to draw your own crease patterns and maybe fold a few tessellations as well. So that's all from me today. Happy folding, everyone, and I will see you in the next video.